This is the Amidon Planet Podcast, episode 35. I'm your host, Joel Amidon. Thank you for joining me on this never-ending quest to figure out how to teach better. Today on the podcast, we have Dr. Linda Angotti, Professor Emerita of Music Education from Kent State University. I first became acquainted with Dr. Angotti this summer when we were placed in the same discussion group for a book club that read How to Be an Antiracist by Ibram X. Kendi. The book club was put on by the Office of Community Engagement and the Division of Diversity and Community Engagement here at the University of Mississippi. It was a wonderful experience and thought-provoking, and, I like to say the word cognitive shove. There was lots of cognitive shoves in reading this book, and then hearing Dr. Angotti's perspective as a teacher and a teacher educator, and I thought, you know what, I definitely wanted to talk about this book on the podcast. We had wonderful discussions during the book club that took place over the entire summer, and I thought, hey, who better to have on the podcast and just to tap into her expertise and perspective. And so without further delay, I want to get us into this episode because we talked about a lot of good stuff. But before we jump into the conversation, just a quick disclaimer: in no way will we be able to communicate the whole value of the book, and even if we did, it would be from our perspective. In other words, if you like what you hear, go get the book for yourself. Seriously, go get the book for yourself. This book was actually sold out when I had to get it for the book club. We mentioned that in the episode, but it's available in paperback and or not paperback, hardcover now at many bookstores, including your local bookstores like Square Books, which is where I got this one here in Oxford, Mississippi. Try to support those local booksellers if you can. So without further delay, here's my conversation with Dr. Linda Angotti about the book, How to Be an Antiracist by Ibram X. Kendi. Dr. Linda Angotti, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Amidon Planet Podcast. Really appreciate your time, and welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Amidon.
And I guess we could be a little bit more informal. We can go by, I can go by Joel. Is it okay if I call you Linda?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. But I also like to acknowledge, like, you've had a long career in teacher education, but maybe you could give some of the listeners a little bit of background on just who you are.
Okay. I am a native of Jackson, Mississippi. Grew up and went to high school and attended Jackson State University. I left Jackson and went to graduate school at the University of Kansas. And after that, I had a career in teacher education, teaching music education at the University of Wyoming, at the Conservatory of Music in Chicago, as well as adjunct positions at Loyola University and in Chicago. And then I got a tenure track position at Kent State University in Ohio, where I retired as an Emeritus Professor after 28 years in 2018.
And then you came down to Oxford.
And then I retired in Oxford. Yes, we decided to retire in Oxford. So I was in Ohio for a long time, 29 years, and we moved to Oxford in 2019.
Nice. And we got introduced to each other through a book club, right? Put on by here at the University of Mississippi, a book club that was organized about the book, How to Be Antiracist by Ibram X. Kendi. And that's going to be the subject of our conversation today. And I know we had it was like, for how long that book club went from, I can't even, like.
It was 18 weeks.
It was 18 weeks. Yeah, 18 weeks.
Whole summer.
Yeah, whole summer. And just, I guess with a global pandemic, you can get some good commitment from folks throughout a summer to have some good conversations, and just knowing the amount of investment that people had, the conversations we had, the consistency that we had throughout. And I thought, hey, this would be a good thing, given your experience in teacher education and kind of the theme of this podcast. It'd be a good thing for us to discuss and share. So thank you for being willing to do this.
I'm excited to do this. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So one thing, I guess, to set up is, we were kind of talking before we hit record here, is, kind of the theme of this podcast is, maybe it's like pocket-sized professional development, that people can kind of get an insight into a book. And maybe they, especially if we're talking to teachers now who are dealing with online and face-to-face classes and all sorts of different setups, quarantines and whatnot, and just trying to, survive a little bit. but maybe this could be a little bit of way to get some, professional development, think about these ideas about what it means to be anti-racist and to get a little bit of insight in this book. I guess the setup of this book is pretty interesting. I don't know if you want to take a shot at it, and maybe I can add some things in about how Kendi set up this book on how to be an anti-racist.
Okay, well, what I liked about the setup is he begins each chapter with definitions of what he's talking about, and then he goes on to explore those definitions and give really concrete examples using a lot of resources, a lot of research. I think the book is well researched, and the references are really good. Yeah. So he does that really well. And what makes it interesting reading for me too is we learn about Kendi because he talks about his growing up. He starts at the very beginning and talks about his educational experiences all the way from a third grade to his graduate degree at Temple University.
And what's cool, I mean, it's not like, hey, here's me, I've got it all figured out, and now you get to, because I have it all figured out, you can, read from these experiences. I mean, he shares some pretty rough parts of his life, but that were illustrative of some of the things that he's talking about. It was, I mean, biographical, but yet, using the, like what you said, all the research that he had to really point out, like, hey, here's some things in my own experience I could point to that's helped me like get to this place that I now find myself.
Yeah, it's really tied together well.
Yeah. And so, I mean, and, say even some of the topics, I mean, if you go through the, all the different, we talked about the definitions of terms that he goes through, and it's like power, biology, ethnicity, body, culture, behavior, color, white, black, class, space, gender, sexuality, failure, success, survival, and thinking about how do all of these sorts of things dealing with the topic of being anti-racist. And so just even to start there about labeling these definitions and getting us to say, here's what we're talking about, and now let's use this research and even his own experiences to shed some light on it. It's very readable too. It's like there's some pretty heady stuff, but it's like something that you can approach. It's a great book. And if it was really when we were setting up the book club, or when the book club was being offered, I mean, I just even trying to buy it, I usually like to get my books in paper, and I like to handle them. And also so I can disconnect from a device. It's always good too. But like you couldn't get it. It was like sold out everywhere. I had to get it on Kindles just to get into the book club. So, but now I got it on paper. So, but should we dive into it? Should we start with some of the categories here?
Yes.
Awesome. So we start with our high fives, or our high five learnings. And actually, just because you've already touched on it, like one of my big learnings was this idea of definitions, and just how, I mean, I remember I had an experience in a higher level math ed course. I think it was like honor or abstract algebra or something. It was like, I look back at those notebooks, I don't understand a thing. But what happened in that class is the instructor said, hey, if you know the definitions, you'll get at least a C in this class. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to memorize these definitions. And because I did that, I had that foundation with which to actually interact with this material that was really like this, kind of Goodwill Hunting sort of like abstract math stuff but because I had these definitions, I was able to make sense of what I was seeing. And I think that's, where Kendi is starting with this idea of like, let's lay out these definitions. And so, and because he does this quote, and it's already on page 9, he talks about the only way to undo racism is to constantly identify and describe it and then dismantle it. Well, you need the definitions to do that, right? And right. So thinking about like, he's giving us these definitions of not only, a lot of times a coupled definition of, hey, here's racism, well, here's anti-racism, and using those definitions to like play off of each other. I really appreciated that. So like every chapter, like you said, starts off with these definitions that gives us a place to start, right, in order to describe what we're seeing. So I know that you like the definitions too, but I just wanted to say like that's one of the things I really liked and I learned a lot from is those definitions.
Me too, because even growing up as an African American, some of the definitions I knew, but I didn't know they were definitions. I've experienced some things, but I didn't know how to define some of the things I've experienced. But that's what he does, and he starts off with defining racist and anti-racist. And he says a racist is one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. An anti-racist is one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. So right off, we learned it's not enough to be to say I'm not a racist,
Right.
but the question is, are you an anti-racist? So he really drives that point home, because you may not be a racist, but you may not be an anti-racist either. So the goal is for everybody to be an anti-racist. That's the goal of the book, to understand what an anti-racist is.
Yeah, and like that that definition is basically saying, like, if I'm standing still, if I'm not actively doing something, well then, it's kind of I've heard the metaphor of like a conveyor belt, right? It's like, if you're just standing still, you're still going with the flow of whatever the conveyor belt is. The conveyor belt is, the institution or society or whatever, like that. There's already
policy.
In policy. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And like, unless you're moving against it, like you're going with it. And I think that there's, I've heard, I think it was either Michael Apple or Bill Tate talking about, I think it's Michael Apple talking about math education, and saying sometimes, like, with, if you're just doing the same sort of practice, you're perpetuating inequities that already exist, right? You're just putting people back into society that are already doing these things. So what are you doing against these sort of things? And so moving against that conveyor belt. So there's no neutral here. There's no neutral.
No neutral at all. Yes. And in chapter 4, he talks about biological races. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. He says, and I think that definition is worth repeating too, a biological racist is a person who expresses the idea that the races are meaningfully different in their biology, and that these differences create a hierarchy of value. A biological anti-racist expresses the idea that the races are meaningfully the same in their biology, and there are no genetic racial differences.
Yeah, that's pretty important. When we think about some of the, I guess we're both in education, right? So looking at where people look at, achievement gaps, right? And right now we're talking about achievement gaps, but then pointing to opportunity gaps and saying, like, achievement gaps, saying like there's differences here based off of this label that has no basis in biology, and then thinking like, well, what's causing this? And like looking at the student, like there's something causing the student. No, we need to look at the opportunity gaps and saying, no, what opportunities are different? Like, what is the system producing that is leading to these achievement gaps? What is happening here within the opportunities to learn that's leading here? So like thinking like, there's something that, what are we pointing to? Are we pointing to the student? Or are we pointing to the system here? And I think, sometimes this definition really plays a part into that, of thinking like, okay, well, what are we really talking about here? Are you saying that there's this achievement gap, that there's going to be this specific difference based off of this label? Or are we saying like, hey, you know what, there's something that's happening within the system, within the school, within the how things are being laid out there, and those opportunities to learn, that's causing these differences. And
children are treated differently in schools because they look different than other children. So that's what he's talking about too. I'm treated a certain way because of my looks, but if you look at an anti-racist viewpoint, there are no genetic racial differences, and teachers should see that. He likes to use the term racist abuse instead of microaggression. And he talks about that in that chapter, because he says racist abuse describes the effect on people more often than a microaggression does. Because as an adult, I can tell you that I have experienced microaggressions, racist abuse, and it is harmful. It can be harmful, and it can affect physical health over time. Mm-hmm. And he gave examples of microaggressions. A white woman who grabs her purse when a black man gets into the elevator, that's a microaggression.
Right.
And we heard recently in the news about Amy Cooper, this white woman who called the police on a black man who was bird watching in Central Park. Yeah. That's a microaggression. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you can imagine if I as an adult feel the anguish of microaggressions, what happens in teacher education? What happens with children in the classroom? And I can tell you, and I believe that African-American students experience microaggressions in public school classrooms every day, both from their peers and from their teachers all over this country.
Yeah, I was just calling up an example because it just came through my email, but it's a paper that I'd read before, but it's dealing with the classroom. It's a paper by Ebony McGee and Danny Martin. They talk about, in the title of the paper is "You Would Not Believe What I Have to Go Through to Prove My Intellectual Value," and thinking about some of these experiences of these students who are in STEM degrees, like from academically successful Black mathematics and engineering students. So they're going into like a high level math classroom, like the one I was describing before, and they would be asked like, "Are you in the right classroom?" or things like that. These like these microaggressions, or these questionings of their capabilities as a student. And so like, they talk about some of the things that they would do. Like if they have a class in a higher level math class, what they would do was buy the textbook, show up early, sit right front, middle, and slam the textbook on their desk and be like, "I'm here. This is my class. Like I'm this is not a mistake. Like I'm here." And so like the fact that they would have to do that in order to show like, "Hey, this is someplace I belong." I'll put a link to that paper in the show notes, because it's pretty powerful when you hear some of these stories about things that have happened. Like, that's I'd never had that experience.
Yeah, I've had that experience. But imagine those people, at least the people you're talking about, they can do that. Mm-hmm. But think about the children, the ninth grader, the sixth grader, the 12th grader. They don't have that wherewithal to be able to do that and say, "I am here." Yeah, the agency. So, even things like when the teacher never calls on them when they raise their hand. And that was one of Kendi's experiences.
Right.
He saw that happen firsthand. When students are treated invisible to the teacher, and even things, and I've seen this a lot, and you've probably heard of this too, when a teacher doesn't correct a student's name properly, some of these African-American or African names may be different than Mary, Johnny, and Sue. Yeah. And the teacher just doesn't even make an effort to pronounce the student's name correctly, even when they have been corrected. So that's a microaggression. And even scheduling tests on religious holidays or cultural holidays, tests or projects scheduled on those days, that's even a microaggression. And I wonder if people, Joel, even realize what they're doing when they're doing these things. Some of these aggressions are deliberate, I'm sure, but sometimes I think people just don't know that they're doing these things. And according to Kendi, they're being abusive and they're using microaggressions.
And I guess, well, okay, so maybe here's the question that's being asked, and like, let's throw it out here, is like, well, how, so maybe someone just heard that and they're like, well, how do I learn? How do I learn about that? And I guess too, that's not wanting to put that on to somebody to teach them. So like, it is maybe about reading. It's about reading these sort of books, or reading the article that we mentioned, or reading, becoming educated on what do these microaggressions look like. And I don't know. What would your response be to someone if they said, well, how do I learn?
Just that, just what you're saying, through research articles, through journal articles, through talking with people. That's one of the most important things. You know, I think people need to spend time talking with people. And you don't have to be friends or have people over for coffee, but just attending workshops and hearing what other people have to say, because we need to get out of our bubbles. Black people have been forced to get out of our bubbles, especially those of us who are in education. We've had to see a whole different side of humanity. We've had to spend time. And I said that to somebody once, you know, we were in doctoral program at KU, and I said, you know, I know you all way better than you know me, because I've had to. I've had to learn. I've had to learn white people, and white people haven't had to learn me. So I think reading the research, talking with people, spending time with people, reading, even today we can read in the newspaper what people are doing and see that it's wrong, because there's so many examples in the news and in the media about little children selling lemonade or people being in the park. So those kinds of things. And when people really want to make a change, and people really want to do things, they'll take note of those things, and they can actually physically take note of those things and say, you know, I don't want to be this way. I'm going to here's my list of microaggressions that I'm beginning, and I'm going to read this book and read this article and listen to this podcast, listen to Amazon Planet, and learn learn what not to do. Yeah. So it's incumbent upon individuals, because you really can't teach that.
Yeah. So like another shameless plug, like we talked with Shamiko Ellis a couple weeks ago about the book Not Light But Fire: How to Lead Meaningful Race Conversations in the Classroom. It was another book club that we had over the summer, but that was another book that like offered actually some practical like advice for teachers on how to, you know, develop the kind of relationships in the classroom, so that you can learn more about each other, but then two, that people feel comfortable having conversations within the classroom that allow these sorts of relationships that can reveal like, oh, you know what, that probably doesn't make sense to, like you said, like have this assignment due on this day because that's a cultural holiday, and I learned about that because I developed a relationship with you and I see what you're doing on the coming weekend or whatever. Like those sorts of things that we can do as an education of ourselves, not only for who our students are, but then also just in general, what are other teachers doing in order to build some relationships. What's another learning you had, Linda?
Well, behavior. In chapter 8, Kendi defines a behavioral racist as someone who makes individuals responsible for the perceived behavior of racial group and makes racial groups for the behavior of individuals. Let me make sure I have that right.
I've got it out. Yeah. One who is making individuals responsible for the perceived behavior of racial groups and making racial groups responsible for the behavior of individuals.
Okay. And a behavioral anti-racist makes racial group behavior fictional and individual behavior real. So that's another one, and I can talk about it in terms of teacher education as well. I grew up in a Black community in Mississippi. I attended segregated schools. I'm dating myself, but I'm proud of that, of my age. I graduated from a historically Black college university, as I told you, Jackson State. And I taught at 4 PWIs in 4 states. So these combined experiences have taught me that there are no monolithic groups. Students are individuals. Their behaviors, whether good or bad, are shaped by their experiences inside and outside the classroom. And I've worked with a large population of students: Black students, white students, brown students, Native American students, just a large population. So Kendi says, and I quote something from page 94, with racist teachers, misbehaving kids of color do not receive inquiry and empathy and legitimacy. We receive orders and punishments and no excuses as if we are adults. Individual behaviors can shape the success of individuals, but policies determine the success of groups, and it is racist power that creates the policies that cause racial inequities. Every time someone racializes behavior, describes something as Black behavior, they're expressing a racist idea. And I think we see that in teacher education and in classrooms as well. We see students' behavior being grouped as though they are representing a group rather than representing themselves as individuals.
Yeah, in this one, I mean, I'm really thankful for this definition. I mean, that the whole behavioral anti-racist is one who is making racial group behavior fictional and individual behavior real. I mean, that's like what you see with the behavior of an individual, I can attribute that to I can't attribute that to a racial group. I mean, that the fictional part I really appreciate, because that just really helps you grab onto that definition. But you see that, I mean, you see that in, conversation, you see that in the news, you see that elsewhere where, conversations with folks who don't understand how to approach behavior from that sort of perspective. And it's like, this is a good definition to point to.
It is. And just approach students as students, just approach students as learners, not Black learners or not white learners. I even heard a teacher say once about a white student who had cornrows. Oh, what's with the, and it was a very negative attitude, very negative tone of voice. What's with the Black hairstyle? She said to her friend, and I was in earshot standing right there. So teachers need to have more positive attitudes about Black and brown children's language, about their ability, what they can and cannot do, and about their behavior and their potential, same as they do with white students. And there are some studies that have talked about that too. Mm-hmm. Studies have also found that teachers have fewer favorable interactions with their Black students than with white students. So here again, we have teachers that sometimes don't look at children as children, but ascribe a whole set of behaviors to race.
Mm-hmm. I like the term that you used before too, is not just thinking of them as students, but thinking of them as learners. Because then what does a student do? You could say a student could do a number of different things. What does a learner do? A learner learns. And so thinking about how am I positioning this student in the best place to learn, and thinking about even their behaviors are like, well, how are they in this classroom? What are the different ways that they can show their expertise, their understanding, their brilliance even within the class? And so now we're thinking of the individual and them demonstrating their competence and then highlighting those different ways that students can show their way of contributing to the classroom, rather than thinking like there's only a singular way to behave or a singular way to show brilliance, right? And that, again, I'm coming from a math ed background where, there's so many different ways now that you could express your understanding of something versus, the limited ways that were available or limited ways that were, valued when I was a student in a math classroom.
And that even applies to preferences and likes. What students like may be different, not based on race, but just based on the individual. Mm-hmm. I remember doing a study once and finding out that Black students didn't like spirituals, and spirituals born in the Black community, but they had different opinions because they were different. They were individuals. Mm-hmm. So I think if teachers could see students as individuals, it would make a whole world of difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So that got me into another thing too. So one of my learnings that I wanted to highlight was page 24. Kendi just does a great job of highlighting these assimilationists and segregationists, and talking about this, the chapter is called Dueling Consciousness, but assimilationist as one who is expressing the racist idea that a racial group is culturally or behaviorally inferior and is supporting cultural, behavioral enrichment programs to develop that racial group. Segregationist, one who is expressing the racist idea that a permanently inferior racial group can never be developed and is supporting policy that segregates away that racial group. And then, then he counters both of those with the anti-racist definition, one who's expressing the idea that racial groups are equals and none needs developing and is supporting policy that reduces racial inequity. So, this is right in the wheelhouse of teacher education because, this was some of the operating principles of what schools did, right? They were assimilationists, they're acting as assimilationists, or they're acting as segregation vehicles. And so, that's definitely a part of the history, maybe even the present of schools, and thinking about how are we positioning them as institutions? What are they operating as? But I'd never thought, the other thing, I never thought about those two words like that before. And again, he's laying it out very good or very well with these definitions.
Yes, he does. And he also gives some of his own experiences growing up as a student. And he talks about his parents and their beliefs as liberation theologists, because they believed in Black liberation theology. And this is when they went to Urbana. So he goes from education to church, and then gives examples of his experiences in Queens, and just it's what very well done, and how he brings those together. And one of the questions that you ask was about what may be a weakness in the book. Mm-hmm. I wanted to see more about assimilationists when compared to segregationists and anti-racists. And I think he could do a whole book on anti-racism and assimilation.
Yeah, we're kind of stepping on it, but yeah, that's and I was reflecting on that, and I thought about you saying that. I'm like, yeah, that's my, it's the let's get critical. It's the critique part. Yeah, I could say that. Yeah, I want more. I want. More on this, because again, this is one of those I guess cognitive shove sort of moments where I'm like, you've seen these two words, but haven't offered the third, right? It was like, here's an option, but are we presenting this anti-racist option, right? Versus, we're going to have to go back and forth between these two options, but no, there is a third option, and he's laying it out like, here it is. Mm-hmm. And so he could really dive deep into this, blow this chapter out a little bit. But what else did you? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to say one thing about that. The final thing he says about that in that chapter is to be anti-racist is to conquer the assimilationist consciousness and the segregationist consciousness. So I'd like to see a whole treatise on that.
Yeah.
That's on page 34, I think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Absolutely. What's another learning you had, Linda?
Well, one was looking at, which I never thought about this either, but I've certainly experienced it, but I so appreciate how he laid out conjoined twins of capitalism and racism in chapter 12. Mm-hmm. So first question that comes to mind, how can America be so divided? Kendi says on page 156 that it's impossible to know racism without understanding its intersection with capitalism. Mm-hmm. And in the 21st century, persisting racial inequalities in poverty, unemployment, and wealth show the life work of the conjoined twins of racism and capitalism. That's on page 157. So when we look at some of the facts he laid out, in which he did a very good job of looking at the research and documenting what he said, the Black poverty rate in 2017 nearly tripled the white poverty rate. The Black unemployment rate was at least twice as high as the white unemployment rate for the last 50 years. The wage gap between Blacks and whites is the largest in 40 years. And the median wealth of white families is about 10 times that of Black families. All of those policies, all of that affects teacher education. And I think these disparities are baked into policy decisions that have an adverse effect on education, from the way we train teachers to where we place them for student teaching, where they get their jobs, how they teach, and ultimately how children learn. So these policies have got to change. Unless, I just feel, Joel, we have got to, and maybe it's teacher education working in conjunction with whomever else, but these disparities have got to get better, because until we see some changes in housing policies, tax policies, education policies, policing even, and unabated mass incarceration and more, we are not going to see the changes that we need to see in education. And we have to even the playing fields for African American, Latinx children and their families. And the way I see to do that, to start doing that, is with the vote. So we don't have to go into politics. You probably don't want me to go into politics on this podcast either. But those disparities, those policies affect teacher education, I think, in all those ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, there's so much in the, what are you saying? We're talking so much about policy, like that you can't not talk about the vote, right? You have to like activate some sort of lever with policy. And so thinking about how are you doing that? Are you getting out there? And it's not too late to think about what's your plan for voting? And those out there that have, I think, unfortunately, the registration date in Mississippi has passed. But if you have not done that, or if you have done that, like thinking about what is your plan for voting, and how are you looking at what are the policies that who you're voting for, who do those people support, not only at the national level, but at the local level as well.
Yes.
Nothing wrong with that. So, and that, I guess, you talked about this, the co-joined twins of capitalism and racism. And that just got me thinking of what was highlighted in the gender chapter on page 188, just the idea of intersectionality. And he does a good job, again, of defining that within the chapter and going a little bit back into where intersectionality came to be defined by, looks like Dr. Williams Crenshaw. But he talks about this race, gender, and like looking at that intersectionality of race and gender and how that could come to be, and thinking about, feminism and racism and that sort of, I don't know if it was eye-opening, but again, this seems to be a theme. The way he lays it out is able to be like, oh, okay, I can see what intersectionality means. That it's like, and for me as a math person, and thinking like a one variable equation is easy to solve. As soon as you add two variables, you start adding some more variables in it, like the complexity of it gets more and more that you have to consider as you're trying to come up with a solution to that equation. Well, same thing here. When we start thinking about the intersectionality of some of these ways of considering people, it's like, whoa, this gets more and more complicated, but still something that we have to keep in mind in dealing as a teacher in classrooms in different ways. Like, how am I thinking about my teaching? Am I thinking about it in just, one-dimensional ways, or am I thinking about it in these multi-dimensional ways?
Right. Because when you look at race and gender, it is very complicated, and we've experienced it in classrooms, and girls are treated different than boys in the classroom, and many classrooms across the country, and Black girls are treated differently. As a matter of fact, Kendi, in one of his stories, talked about the makeup of his classroom, the demographic makeup of his classroom. And the little girl who was ignored when she raised her hand was a shy little girl who never raised her hand. And he sat on the back so he could get a view of the whole classroom. The teacher was white. The little girl who raised her hand was Black, and the teacher overlooked her. The one time she raised her hand, the teacher overlooked her and looked at her and then called on a little white girl. So those are the kinds of things that we need to train our teachers to see and to know, and hopefully just pray that they're not doing these kinds of things deliberately. But in many cases, we know there are, because truth be told, there are racist teachers, teachers who are racist.
Yeah. And what's important there too is, like, what do you do when you're confronted by, the data or the realization or whatever it is that's saying, like, hey, there's some gaps in the way, or the opportunity gaps in how you are positioning your classroom. Not saying that anyone is perfect, but thinking about how do you then respond to that realization? How do you respond is like, well, that's, and I think that's where this, like Kendi talks about this peelable sticker of whether, being racist or anti-racist. I mean, he even talks about it his own experience. Like, in some actions he was acting racist, some actions he's acting anti-racist, and it's a constant, like, action moving forward. So, like, thinking about what's the next action given what you know and what you understand, how do you keep going forward? We even talked about with microaggressions, if not, when you become aware, like, this is okay, so how do you act going forward? I think that's something that we need to be, if we're confronted by something, how do we respond? How do we keep going forward as teachers?
Yeah, I think that's important to know. You point out, and Kendi does point out, that we can be anti-racist and racist at the same time, depending on situations and where we are. And even says that Black people can also be racist. So that was a revelation to me. But when the way he explained it, I understood what he said. So we're anti-racist and racist sometimes at the same time, in the same day of the week.
Yeah. If we keep growing, we got to keep growing.
Yes.
That's our next question is, like, now what do you do going forward, having read this book? And so I know you're coming from a different perspective, like coming down here in your retirement years, but still thinking about, like, how would you have approached your teacher education classroom, or even your teacher education classroom, or what recommendations would you have for me going forward, and thinking about what would you do differently in the training of teachers?
Okay, that's a big one, and I'll try not to be all over the map here with this, but I have to just say this because it's been on my mind, and it came up recently. First of all, anti-racist pedagogy does not look like patriotic education. Let's just get that out in the open. This current president accused schools of teaching students, and I quote, hateful lies about this country. And he said he would take steps to restore patriotic education. After I saw that comment and read it and looked a little bit at his speech at the National Archives when he talked about that, I ran across Kendi because I was reading some more of Kendi. And Kendi says, and I quote, what Trump calls patriotic education is racist education. And then I heard with a group of friends my age, and they're progressive, but daughters of the Confederacy. They agree even that patriotic education is throwback to when all of us were in elementary and junior high school. We weren't taught anything. We weren't taught the correct history. We weren't of this country. So broadly speaking, anti-racist pedagogy first teaches the truth about the history of this country, and truth and facts in all disciplines, including mathematics and science, and even in music. So we have to make certain that we're balancing what students are learning. And then in anti-racist pedagogy, and I think teachers who are teachers of teachers need to show respect for differences and then affirm those differences among students, and they can help African American Latinx students develop a strong, positive racial and cultural identity, and then treat people as individuals, because there's no such thing as Black behavior, let alone irresponsible Black behavior. And I don't know if teachers are guilty of this, but today, but I know in recent years, teachers have been guilty of having the attitude that some of their students are superior to others, and that's as individuals. Of course, students are better musicians because they practice more, or better at math than other students because they have the skill set. But I mean, just seeing people as superior intellectually over others is something that Kendi talks about in biology, biological racism, and we have got to stop that. And I'll pause here for a minute after I say this. Anti-racist pedagogy is not colorblind, because if people don't see students of color, how can they identify racial inequity, or how can they challenge racial policies that affect students of color? I cringe every time I hear a teacher say, well, I'm colorblind. Do they even know what they're saying? So I'll pause there, and then I can add more things. But I think does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean,
what we could do. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thinking about even that last point about hearing the colorblind stands. I mean, that was something that I would hear a lot, and it's like you think like that was like someone, or even let's just point it at myself, that maybe that was something from my perspective where I grew up in a very homogenous community, small rural community up in northern Wisconsin, and to be colorblind, hey, I'm going to treat everyone the same. It sounds good initially, but then you think like, well, no, that's you're ignoring the part of someone's identity and a part of what makes them who they are, and part of like learning more about them. And you're basically shutting the door to that. And so instilling a curiosity about students, and even using some of the things I think even from like Matthew Kay's book that I mentioned earlier, just about opening up spaces to learn more about folks, how they, little bit different life experiences, a little bit different experience about how they demonstrate their learning, and just like all these different things that you can learn from a sense of curiosity about not only about our students, but just about people, and like how then you can use that within the classroom to be a better teacher. And I think, whenever we shut that down through like that stance of being colorblind, we're in dangerous territory there. So no, I think what you're presenting is definitely some ideas that we need to consider, and what actions go along with them going forward.
Yes, thank you. I'm glad that you agree.
Well, and there's something actually, I did another podcast called the Teaching Math Teaching Podcast, and we talked with two researchers that put out this classroom observation tool called Equip, and it's basically looking at participation. And it's something that as a teacher could do for their own teaching, they could analyze their own teaching, or something like a teacher supervisor could use. But it basically just looks at how do students self-identify, putting that within a classroom observation tool, and then looking to see if you identify patterns in participation. So it's a very simple tool, but it's looking at, are there things within your own practice that you're missing? Like you're not noticing, like, whoa, yeah, I'm calling on certain people more, or I might be calling on my class like representationally equivalently, or whatever. That's a bad way to phrase it. But basically I'm calling on people the same, but for some folks, I'm asking yes or no questions, and some folks I'm asking how or why questions. So like digging in deeper. And so it's just a way, it's a tool, it's called Equip, and I'll put a link to it in the class notes, but it's a tool where you could look at those things to see, are there patterns that that I don't necessarily notice that within my own teaching, or maybe I think, you know what, maybe I am doing that. I want to get some data to see what kind of opportunity gaps maybe exist in my own teaching. And so giving yourself some quantitative data to back up, like, hey, am I providing a good space in order for students to demonstrate their understanding, and thinking about what are the different ways that I might be showing some bias within my teaching. So Equip is something that, or something like that, where you're interrogating your own practice, because as Kendi said in the beginning right away, is the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it. So, to be vigilant and to look out for it, and like how do I provide, how could I provide tools for my future teachers to say, hey, here's a way that you can look at your practice. So that's something I want to incorporate going forward, is giving them ways to look at their own practice and say, like, how am I presenting an equitable space for people to learn, or am I providing enough opportunities for people to demonstrate their understanding about content? Just at least taking steps forward that way in looking at practice.
And what you're talking about, I think, is self-knowledge, whether or not they have the knowledge, skills, and even the attitudes to create a democratic classroom and to implement culturally responsive and inclusive curriculum and practices. And that comes with examining oneself and seeing what it is that you're doing, why are you doing it, and taking stock. And I used to tell my students all the time in my methods class, every time they teach, reflect on what they taught and how they did. This was when they were out practice teaching, when they were student teaching, because we had students to go out and observe and teach before their student teaching experience. So every time, just reflect on what you did and how you're doing it. And that helps students to become aware of what they're doing when they reflect, not just go on to the next thing. So they have to just take time to do that. And I think in-service teachers have to do that too, reflect on what they're doing after they've done it, or what they have done.
Yeah, and I think then using some of these, definitions or whatnot, the definitions of being anti-racist, the various ones throughout this book, is a way I think of like flipping on sensors, where you're flipping on sensors to like, oh, this is something else I could notice. This is something else I could notice. Because without those sensors flipped on, your idea about what a good classroom practice looks like might be very narrow, and versus flipping these things on, and all of a sudden I'm noticing other things, or even to figure out like what are microaggressions, or what are these different ways of seeing racism exist within this space. Like, I've got more ways to notice those things. That means there's my reflections on my practice can be richer and can help me move forward better if I have these other ways of noticing things that are happening within my practice.
And I want to say one more thing about that. Teachers need to understand how their own culturally based perspective influence their perceptions and their expectations, and how they were raised, and if that fits what they're trying to do as teachers. I've met, and I won't call names, but I've met a couple of people since I've been in this area, since retirement, who are not training to be teachers, but they are certainly sharp. And they're white girls who were raised one way, and they, since being here at Ole Miss, they see how the perspectives they learned and the way they were taught to perceive things are just not in line with what they see now. Mm-hmm. And they see a bigger and brighter future for themselves, because they are not locked into those narrow things they learned growing up in their family. and that doesn't mean they don't love their families, but they've learned, they have a different perspective.
Yeah.
And that's called growth, I think.
Yeah, and Kendi does a good job of kind of laying out his own, like your story. You learn from your story too, to interrogate where you came from, what your beliefs are or were, and how you can continue to grow. And like those are those markers. I mean, I think, you know, I had a narrative about my own background of like pulling myself up by my bootstraps, but then, you know, acknowledging, you know, there's some privilege there. There's a significant amount of privilege there, and like recognize, okay, well, where did that come in, and what do I do with that going forward, right? And so, like, again, sensors flipped on, and meaning maybe a different way of going about my practice moving forward. So,
Yes.
all right, Linda, the challenge is to sum up this this book in 7 words. That's a big one, given all the stuff that's in this book. But I think you did a good job. You want to share yours?
Yes, and easy peasy for me, because it comes from my upbringing. Treat others like they are your family.
Love it. Yeah, that's great. And I had I was playing around with it. I was like, be anti-racist. There is no neutral. But then I was like, wait. I got to go back to my definitions. Act anti-racist. There is no neutral. So it's that whole idea about that acting. Like it's about continuous moving forward. As soon as you have one action, you got to continue with the next one to keep that label up. So, all right. So, and given you have a tremendous amount of experience as an educator, I'm just curious, like, what insight do you have on teaching? Like, what are some of the good stuff that you did with teaching? What is some advice that you'd have going forward for any teachers that might be listening to this podcast?
Wow. Okay, let me just start that with a James Baldwin quote, just in case I don't get to say it. He quotes, I quote James Baldwin, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Mm. So I think teachers need to take off rose-colored glasses, look as clearly as they can into teacher education, what it is they want to do, the kind of teacher they want to be, the kind of person they want to be, and then double down on that. Double down on that with everything they read and hear and see. And it's like I used to tell my doctoral students, you have to funnel in. You can't, as you go through the program, you can't be all over the place. At one point, you have to, your research but the articles you read, everything has to start funneling in, and that's how you become the expert, or supposedly the expert at something. So I think teachers need to, especially pre-service teachers, need to read as much as they can and look at research, because we don't have our teachers look at research too much in undergraduate classes. So look at research in their field and look at research related to anti-racism, and then just double down on all of that. And I say that because I've gotten some notes lately, 2 emails recently that from undergraduates that I haven't seen in years, who've said, thank you for this. And their perspectives have changed, and they have shared with me how their perspectives have changed based on experiences they had in my classes. So that's one thing I think teachers need to do, and I would suggest teachers do, just look inside and look outside of themselves and make the changes that are necessary. And don't be afraid, because the kind of teacher that they want to be is up to them. So don't be afraid to make changes that are necessary. That's what these 2 girls did. They came from their hometowns and they came to college, and they saw the need to make changes and to broaden themselves, and they're doing that even in the way they talk and think. So teachers, pre-service teachers, cannot be afraid to change what needs to be changed. And certainly, somewhere they will learn that they have support in what they're doing.
Yeah. great. I mean, I'm a big proponent of having like a pocket-sized philosophy statement to use that to like reinforce like what you're doing in the classroom and to figure out like how I might want to, I like the word funnel. I like the word you said funnel. I use that with my doctoral students too, the idea of a funnel. But like having that sort of pocket-sized philosophies, like, hey, here's what matters to me. But then that also could mean that I get exposed to ideas and things like maybe it is anti-racist pedagogy that has been put in front of you and be like, I need to figure out how to incorporate this in and what does this mean to my practice, and like having that question of like, well, what does anti-racist pedagogy look like? What does that look like in my teaching, in my context with the classrooms that I've been put in, and or whatever, or even I like to think too, anti-racist pedagogy or just teaching from this perspective extends beyond the classroom, right? Extends to how am I as a parent, how in any situation where I'm in a teaching role or trying to influence somebody with their relationship with some content, there's all sorts of ways I could be thinking about that and how am I leveraging those ideas that presented by Kendi within any of those roles. So there's some work to do, but I mean, as long as we're continuing to take steps forward, like that's all you can ask for.
That's all we can ask for. And even baby steps forward, better than not moving forward at all.
That's right. So, well, Linda, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your expertise and the thoughtfulness with which you approached this book and the way that we had this conversation. This was good stuff. There's lots, and like we always say at the beginning of these podcasts, is like there's no way we're going to cover this book, but I think we did a pretty good job. But I mean, I would highly encourage everyone to go pick up a copy for themselves. Anything else that you wanted to add before we?
Just stay safe, everybody.
There you go. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Joel.
That's it. Lots of stuff there. Man, we could have gone for another whole episode if we wanted to. We had lots to discuss in this book. And so, again, can't stress it enough. Please go get the book if you can. There's links to purchase it in the show notes, which you can find at amazonplanet.com/episode 35. You can also, again, support those local bookstores. But wherever you get it, it's a good read. And just lots of definitions, lots of ways that we can think about what it means to be anti-racist, what it means to root racism out by learning to identify it, describe it, and dismantle it. And so thankful for this book, thankful for the conversation with Dr. Angotti, and just thankful for all you out there who are listening. And if you're looking for ways to support the podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. Subscribe to the Amazon Planet download, which will contain teaching resources and updates from Amazon Planet. Follow at Amazon Planet on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or you can like the Amazon Planet Facebook page. Check out the Amazon Planet store or the Amazon Planet bookshop. We've got I think right now there's a couple orders going out for hoodies and shirts. So if you want to jump on that, by the time this episode lands, you should be able to do that. If not, you can start a new one, and they'll put another order in. But also the Amazon Planet Bookshop, any purchases you make there of something like How to Be an Anti-Racist, if you purchase that book through those links and the show notes, the part of that purchase will go back to support the podcast. And links to both those places, both the store and the bookshop, can be found in the footer at AmazonPlanet.com. They can also be found in the show notes at AmazonPlanet.com/episode 35. Thank you again for listening to this episode of the Amazon Planet podcast. Thank you, Dr. Linda Angotti, for her expertise and sharing her perspectives. We're just thankful for that. Thankful to Matt Mifflin for the music in this episode. And finally, thank you to all of you out there who are seeking to teach better and be the good in the world by investing in the lives of others. This world is a better place because you have decided to use the gifts you have been given to serve others. Thank you for all that you do. Peace.